This is the definition of RTI, response to intervention, from the National Association of State Directors of Special Education. And when we're talking about high quality instruction, we're talking about scientifically research-based that is taught with fidelity, because this gives us confidence that it will be effective with a large majority of students. The other piece is the learning rate over time. Learning rate over time refers to information about how well the instruction is working for individual students or even for small groups of students over time. Levels of performance gives us a snapshot of how well a student is doing compared to other students, or maybe how well students are doing in the district or even the state. Rate of growth gives us more of a kind of motion picture as to how well our instruction is working for individual students or small groups of students. So those educational decisions that we would be making might include, is our instruction working? If not, how do we need to change it? If so, is the student catching up to his or her peers? How far behind is the student? What resources do we need? What kinds of interventions and levels of intensity are necessary? And RTI data can also just be part of the data that's needed for a full individualized evaluation under IDEA. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. Again, I talked a little bit about that discrepancy model last week, but just to give you kind of a bigger picture, the IQ achievement discrepancy model assesses whether or not there's a significant difference between a student's scores on a test of general intelligence, like an IQ test, and then the scores obtained on an achievement test, so something like the Woodcock-Johnson. The IQ achievement discrepancy model is an approach that traditionally was used to identify children with learning disabilities. So if a student's score on the IQ test was at least 2 standard deviations, which is about 30 points higher than his or her score on the achievement test, the student was described as having a significant discrepancy between IQ and achievement, and therefore they had a learning disability. The problem with using this discrepancy model is that we get into this kind of wait and fail model. So it requires that students must chronically fail in school before that we're providing any sort of remedial help or special education supports. But it also fails to consider what other outside factors, such as poor or inconsistent instruction, may be contributing to a child's learning. So that severe discrepancy between the test scores provided no useful information about why the student was doing poorly academically. So it gave us limited instructional utility. Different states and even different school districts within states have often used different formulas, but many causes for concern exist with using this IQ achievement discrepancy model and for identifying students with disabilities. Again, it doesn't show you that children have learning disabilities while they're still in primary grades frequently, because you don't have a big enough gap yet. So even though you may have children who are referred as early as kindergarten, they may not have a large enough discrepancy. And then because they are not labeled as being learning disabled, they're not getting that remedial help that they need. So students often struggled for years prior to having been identified. And so they weren't given the support they needed in early grades. We also know that information that is gathered from IQ and achievement assessments don't necessarily indicate what each student's specific learning needs are. The assessment doesn't tell us anything about the classroom instruction. and it doesn't tell us about whether the classroom instruction is even currently meeting the students' needs. So there were a lot of factors that were kind of misidentifying or under-identifying or disproportionately identifying students with learning disabilities. Let's talk a little bit about where RTI came from. There was a President's Commission that held public hearings throughout the U.S. and received written comments about the state of special education, and they concluded that special educators were spending too much time doing the paperwork and not enough time teaching. Also, general and special education seemed to be operating kind of as two separate systems instead of a whole. So there was an LD Summit, and that brought together some leading researchers, parents, educators to discuss the issues around learning disability identification. And so it was decided that learning disabilities is a valid construct, that these students do require special education. The exact prevalence of students with learning disabilities is unknown, and that the IQ achievement discrepancy was not adequate for identifying students with learning disabilities. So there was a National Research Council report, and some recommendations were made to promote the use of early screening and intervention practices and this RTI model. And the premise was that if school-wide behavior and early reading programs could help culturally and linguistically diverse students receive the support they needed, then the students who exhibit ongoing problems would decrease, and students who are continuing to struggle would be less likely to then further require special education. So IDEA in 2004 recommended but didn't abandon this whole IQ achievement discrepancy model, but it did urge states, local districts to use early screening and intervention so that we were able to identify students who were beginning to struggle. They also recommended a multi-tiered intervention strategy, and they asked districts to review their own practices as it related to identifying students who were making progress. This slide and the next couple of slides talk about how IDEA in 2004 really changed the framework and brought RTI into the mix. So you can read along each of these slides to see what changed in the new legislation that impacted RTI. This breakdown gives you the focus of response to intervention. In the end, the focus is really about an ounce in prevention, or a stitch in time, if you will. This particular slide gives you a visual about the current system, or a system that is not using an RTI framework. You can see that there's a fragmented approach, that you have a lot of different groups of people providing different services to students. It's not coherent, it's not organized, and you don't have this communication going on between the different components, between general ed and reading recovery, or Title I, remedial reading, or special education. Everyone is pulling students out and bringing them into small circles, but there's no way of knowing whether or not all these groups are also talking to one another. Under RTI, you have very specific areas of concentration. So you have a general education classroom where you have specific strategies. You have interventions that are being used, and then you have special education, which is used as that kind of final tier if interventions aren't successful. The same people who were providing the services that were shown in the previous slide are still there. That reading specialist is still there, that special educator is still there, but it's more streamlined, and you have better communication among each of these professionals. When we talk about the critical features of RTI, there's a couple of really important components. One is high quality instruction. That means we have effective instruction. It's explicit, it's systematic, It's strategic. We have fidelity measures, which means that we document the procedures that we're implementing, whatever intervention we're doing accurately as described and validated through the research. So if we're doing something like a Wilson Reading Program, we are implementing that program exactly as it is outlined and as it has been researched so that we know that we are going to have fidelity of treatment. It also includes instructional and behavioral differentiation so that we're meeting students where they are. It requires frequent assessment, so universal screening on academic and behavior, that we're looking at the entire school as a whole, that we're doing some diagnostic tests, so we're identifying areas of need for interventions. We have some formative assessment. We're doing that ongoing progress assessment through curriculum-based measurements. So looking at where our students are achieving and keeping track of that progress and then changing interventions accordingly. We're making database decision making, which we would do through that formative assessment. That we are also looking at determining students' response to intervention in relation to the rate of their learning and their achievement level, especially as it compares to peers. So we want to make sure, are they learning as quickly as their peers? Are they learning as much as their peers? This is where students start to fall between the cracks, particularly when we look at the rate. You know, we will say that a student's making progress, but are they making enough progress? The other thing that RTI focuses on is interpreting the data to determine whether or not the interventions we're using is effective. Is a student making that progress? And then how do we make changes to those interventions? Do we change the grouping? Do we put that student in a different group? Do we go to a specialized program? Does that student need more intervention? So the length of the treatment that we're giving them. Do they need an additional support? And this may also include eligibility or an exit from being in a special education program. In RTI, the different levels of intervention are called tiers. And these tiers are primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So you can see that it's a multi-tiered model of education and service delivery. And as you move up, you have increasingly intense services that are correlated with increasing levels of the learner's needs. So the different tiers of interventions are designed to provide curriculum and instructional processes that are aimed at improving the student's response to the instruction and to improving the student outcomes. So as you look at each tier, know that in every single tier, progress monitoring is required with the frequent probes so that we're getting the data we need on the students and we know if they're making progress or if they need more intense instruction. If a student's not making progress, then the team might look to move the student to the next tier. So any decision to move a student from one tier to another is based on data that's obtained through progress monitoring. Each of those subsequent tiers represents more intensive interventions. So the changes may be in the instructional programs. It could include increased frequency of interventions, intensity, duration. And also as you move up the tiers, the frequency of the probes or the check-ins to collect data also increases. This flowchart represents the three different tiers of RTI, and actually it's flipped from the triangle. So your tier 1, which is normally at the bottom of the triangle, is actually at the top. So that's your general education setting, whereas down at the bottom, which is usually the top of the triangle, is your special education setting. But I just want you to see how if students aren't responsive or are responsive to a certain tier, they can move up or down depending on how they are doing within that particular tier and using those particular interventions.